One of the great things about exploring the ramparts is that you kind of get away from the city centre of Ypres, and it's a very quiet place, a place to really think about the Great War. And there's so many crisscross paths of the Great War as you walk the ramparts. And I've moved away from where the sally ports are and come round to the Lille Gate. These named gates were named after the cities that the roads that went through them took the travellers to. So the Menin Gate took you to Menin, and the Lille Gate took you to Lille. The other gates that once stood at Ypres were dismantled when the ramparts were dismantled in the decades before the Great War. But this was an important gate. The Menin Gate is much more famous, but the Lille Gate was a really important route out to the front line, perhaps used more during the war than the Menin Gate itself. It was also the location of headquarters. It said that General Plumer had an HQ here during the war, and after the war there was a war museum established right by the gate in a door that led into the ramparts, because beneath me are casemates and chambers that were utilised by the British Army during the conflict. That became one of the first war museums, and today it leads us across to the Lille Gate Cemetery, the Ramparts Cemetery, where the dead who were buried there from the front line or died of wounds in the medical facilities that were in this part of the city were buried during the conflict. So the Lille Gate, an important part of our understanding of the Great War. Whenever I come round to the Lille Gate, I always stop here on the bridge, because the author Henry Williamson, who wrote Tarka the Otter, was a veteran of the Great War. He'd served here with the London Rifle Brigade and the Machine Gun Corps, and he was obsessed with Ypres. He travelled to Ypres many times, and in his book The Wet Flanders Plain, he takes a walk, as I've done today, along the ramparts and stops here at the Lille Gate and looks out across the battlefields to the old Ypres Salient to remember his comrades in ancient sunlight, as he calls them, who fell there during those 4 years of the Great War. So it's a poignant place to come and stop and think about veterans who returned here after the war, and the remembrance of their fallen mates who died in Flanders fields. And a generation later, a century later, here are we left to carry that torch of remembrance and continue to recall those men and women who came to Flanders during the Great War and who served, and the many who never returned. So when we walk places like this, we are walking in the footsteps of those who fought here, but in the footsteps of veterans like Williamson who returned after the war. I'm on the Rose Coombs walk near the Lille Gate. Rose Coombs was the Special Collections Officer at the Imperial War Museum, and she was the author of the classic guidebook Before Endeavours Fade. Rose was an immense First World War authority. Her knowledge was just incredible, and she was a frequent visitor to Ypres. And the Lille Gate and the Ramparts Cemetery, which we're going to visit, was her favourite spot. And when she died in the 1990s, she requested that her ashes be scattered here. And the local authorities renamed this little route over this part of the ramparts in her honour. We owe people like Rose so much. She gave so much of her knowledge to us through her book, through the work that she did. She was one of those early wayfinders of the Great War who paved the way for us today to visit these battlefields. And it's the dead in that cemetery that she loves so much that we'll go and see now. I've come into the Ramparts Cemetery at the Lille Gate, which is located right on the ramparts itself. It's a small cemetery, an original wartime cemetery, where the dead from some of the frontline positions just to the south of Ypres, places like Saint-Loire, for example, were brought back for burial. But close to here were a number of medical facilities where soldiers were brought to wounded, and then they died of their wounds and were buried in this cemetery here on the Ramparts. So it's quite a mix of regiments and quite a few support unit soldiers in here as well. So Royal Army Medical Corps, Royal Engineers, Royal Artillery, and also quite a number of men from the Maori Pioneer Battalion. They were the pioneers to the New Zealand Division that served at Gallipoli in 1915 and then on the Western Front. And they were considered very highly by not just the New Zealanders but by the men in the British Expeditionary Force, and they were used extensively throughout the war as pioneers, combat pioneers on the battlefield, fighting alongside the infantry soldiers in the attacks here at Ypres, for example, along the Messines Ridge and also at Passchendaele. But it's a very picturesque cemetery located in this quiet corner of Ypres, and it's a place where you can come and think about those who fought here in the Great War and remember their sacrifice. And each headstone, of course, an individual story. Many years of the war represented amongst the headstones that are in this cemetery, but in particular the early war period of 1914-15. And I'm walking past Royal Fusiliers, sappers from the Royal Engineers, men who were part of the tunnelling companies who had their headquarters near to here. It's very much a cemetery that the men buried in it are part of its story. And I guess that's why Rose Coombs, that great guardian of the Great War for many years when it was forgotten, and the wayfinder that enabled people like me and many others to come back to these battlefields, I guess that's why she wanted her ashes scattered here at the Ramparts Cemetery in this picturesque site overlooking the battlefields of Flanders.